correctly, Unit 5. Now here's Mike to discuss pesticides in the environment.
The environment is everything that is around us. It includes not only the natural elements that the word environment most often brings to mind, but also people and the man-made components of our world. Neither is the environment limited to the outdoors. It also includes the indoor areas in which we live and work. The environment, then, is much more than the oceans and the ozone layer. It is the air, soil, water, plants, animals, houses, restaurants, office buildings, and factories, and all that they contain. Anyone who uses a pesticide, indoors or outdoors, in a city or in the country, must consider how that pesticide will affect the environment. Pesticide users should consider several things. One is, how will this pesticide affect the immediate environment at the site where it is being used? And what are the dangers the pesticide will move out of the site area and cause harm to other parts of the environment? Pesticides can harm all types of environments if they are not used correctly. Responsible pesticide users know and follow good practices that achieve effective pest control with very little risk to the environment. Pesticide product labeling statements are intended to alert you to particular environmental concerns that a pesticide product poses. Use good judgment too. The lack of a particular precautionary statement doesn't necessarily mean that the product poses no harm to the environment. Both the public and the Environmental Protection Agency are becoming increasingly concerned about harmful effects on the environment from the use of pesticides. As a result, the EPA is looking closely at environmental effects as it considers new applications for registration, and it also is taking this into account when looking at existing pesticide registrations. Hazards to humans had been the primary reason for EPA to classify pesticides as restricted use. Now, more and more pesticide labels list environmental effects such as contamination of groundwater or toxicity to birds or aquatic invertebrates as reasons for restriction. When environmental contamination occurs, it is a result of either point source or non-point source pollution. Point source pollution comes from a specific, identifiable place or point. Pesticide spill that moves into a storm sewer is an example of point source pollution. Non-point source pollution comes from a wide area. The movement of pesticides into streams after broadcast application is an example of non-point source pollution. Non-point source pollution from pesticide applications is the source that has most commonly been blamed for pesticide contamination in the outdoor environment. But more and more studies are revealing that, in fact, much environmental contamination does not result from non-point source pollution. Contamination also results from point sources, such as wash water and spills produced at equipment cleanup sites, improper disposal of containers, water from rinsing containers, and excess pesticides, pesticide storage sites where leaks and spills are not correctly cleaned up, and spills that occur while mixing concentrates or loading pesticides into application equipment. These kinds of tasks are involved with nearly every pesticide use, whether the pesticide is applied outdoors or in and around an enclosed structure. As a pesticide handler, especially if you use or supervise the use of restricted use pesticides, you must become aware of the potential for environmental contamination during every phase of your pesticide operation. Pesticide uses are restricted because of environmental concerns. Whenever you release a pesticide into the environment, whether intentional or accidental, consider whether there are sensitive areas in the environment at the pesticide use site that might be harmed by contact with the pesticide, whether there are sensitive off-site areas near the use site that might be harmed by contact with the pesticide, whether there are conditions in the environment at the pesticide use site that might cause the pesticide to move off-site, and whether you need to change any factors in your application or in the pesticide use site to reduce the risk of environmental contamination. Sensitive areas are sites or living things that are easily injured by a pesticide. Sensitive areas outdoors include areas where groundwater is near the surface or easily accessed, such as wells, sinkholes, porous soil, areas in or near surface water, areas near schools, playgrounds, hospitals, and other institutions, areas near the habitats of endangered or threatened species, areas near apiaries or honeybee sites, wildlife refuges or parks, and areas near ornamental gardens, food or feed crops, or other sensitive plantings. Sensitive areas indoors include areas where people, especially children, pregnant women, the elderly, or the sick, live, work, or are cared for, areas where food or feed is processed, prepared, stored, or served, areas where domestic or confined animals live, eat, or are otherwise cared for, and areas where ornamentals or other sensitive plantings are grown or maintained. Sometimes pesticides must be deliberately applied to a sensitive area to control pests. These applications should be performed by persons who are well trained about how to avoid causing injury in such areas. At other times, the sensitive area is part of a larger target site. Whenever possible, take special precautions to avoid direct application to the sensitive area. For example, leaving an untreated buffer zone around sensitive areas is often a practical way to avoid contaminating them. In still other instances, the sensitive area may be near a site that is used for pesticide application, mixing, loading, storage, disposal, or equipment washing. The pesticide users must take precautions to avoid the accidental contamination of the sensitive area. For example, a permanent site for mixing, loading, or equipment washing could be equipped with a collection pad or tray to catch and contain leaks, spills, or wash water. Pesticides that move away from the release site may cause environmental contamination. Pesticides move away from the release site both indoors and outdoors and may cause harm in both environments. Pesticides move in several ways, including in air through wind or through air currents generated by ventilation systems, in water through runoff or leaching, and on or in objects, plants, or animals, including humans that move or are moved off-site. Pesticide movement away from the release site in the air is usually called drift. Pesticide particles, dust, spray droplets, and vapors all may be carried off-site in the air. People who mix, load, and apply pesticides outdoors usually are aware of the ease with which pesticides drift off-site. People who handle pesticides indoors may not realize how easily some pesticides move off-site in the air currents created by ventilation systems and by forced air heating and cooling systems. Lightweight particles such as dust and wettable powders are easily carried by moving air. Granules and pellets are much heavier and tend to settle out of air quickly. Small spray droplets also are easily carried in air currents. High pressure and fine nozzles produce very small spray droplets that are very likely to drift. Lower pressure and coarse nozzles produce larger droplets which have less drift potential. The likelihood that pesticide particles and spray droplets will drift off-site depends partly on the way they are released. Pesticides released close to the ground or to the floor are not as likely to be caught up in air currents as those released from a greater height. Pesticides applied in an upward direction or from an aircraft are the most likely to be carried on air currents. Pesticide vapors move about easily in air. Fumigate pesticides are intended to form a vapor when they are released. Persons using fumigants must take precautions to make sure the fumigant remains in a sealed container until it's released into the application site, which also must be sealed to prevent the vapor from escaping. Some non-fumigant pesticides also can vaporize and escape into the air. The labeling of volatile pesticides often includes warning statements that the pesticide handler should heed. Anytime you release a volatile pesticide in an enclosed area, consider the hazards not only to yourself and to fellow workers, but also to people, animals, and plants that are in or near the release site or that may enter the area soon after release. Pesticide particles and liquids may be carried off-site in water. Pesticides can enter water through drift, leaching, and runoff from nearby applications. Spills, leaks, and back siphoning from nearby mixing, loading, storage, and equipment storage sites, and improper disposal of pesticides, rinses, and containers. Most pesticide movement in water is across the treated surface, runoff, or downward from the surface, leaching. Runoff and leaching may occur when too much liquid pesticide is applied, leaked, or spilled onto a surface, or too much rainwater, irrigation water, or other water gets onto a surface containing pesticide residue. Most surface water contamination is caused by runoff. Runoff water in the outdoor environment can contaminate drainage ditches, streams, ponds, and other water resources. Contamination from indoor sites can reach water resources through drains or from improper disposal. Pesticides that leach downward through the soil in the outdoor environment sometimes reach groundwater. Runoff water in the indoor environment may get into domestic water systems and from there into groundwater sources. Groundwater is located beneath the Earth's surface in soil and rock. Groundwater may only move a few feet per month or year, except in limestone areas. A large area of groundwater is called an aquifer. This diagram illustrates just how important groundwater is to us. The worldwide water supply is made up of mostly saline water, salt water. Only about 5% of that water is fresh. And most of that water, about 68%, is groundwater. So we depend on that groundwater for our water supply. Most of us do. Some of us depend on treated water, but in general, most of our water supply comes from groundwater. Most of the water that we have available to us remains the same in terms of percentage available from our environment. It does move about through what's called the hydrologic cycle. So water evaporates from surfaces and such as the oceans or streams and lakes. It transpires through plants and eventually ends up in clouds, for example. We get condensation, precipitation, and then you get surface runoff or percolation into the water table. and into the groundwater. And so the water moves in this hydrologic cycle. This animation will give you an opportunity to learn a little bit more about the hydrologic cycle. In order to use it, you need to click your mouse on the various definitions and to move through those definitions to learn how the hydrologic cycle works. When you're done, just click on the next button to move to the next slide.
All I see is an arrow having a seizure.
Yeah, you're gonna see that, so.
Also, did he seriously call it saline water?
That's right.
I've never heard that term.
Yeah, that's what we mean by salt water, yeah.
Saline water?
Here we have an example of two different types of aquifers. One aquifer is very shallow and unconfined and very available to surface water contamination. It's usually what we refer to as a shallow water table, for example. And then we also have a confined aquifer illustrated here. And the confined aquifer is usually protected by some type of impermeable layer over it so that it tends to be tend to be a little deeper, but it's also confined so that it can't easily be contaminated by surface waters. The aquifers, the groundwater in the aquifers is recharged by or replaced by water moving through the ground to the aquifers from sources such as rain, lakes, streams, and even irrigation water. The above ground water moves about through evaporation, surface movement, and gravity. This diagram gives us an opportunity to emphasize a couple points, additional points about groundwater. One is that we mentioned that it flows, and it does very slowly through the soil, except in certain strata. But generally, groundwater flows very slowly through the strata. It can move, and it can actually recharge out on the surface into the ocean or into lakes and streams if it's shallow enough. We also have information here on terms such as the saturated zone, where we often call the groundwater, which is saturated with water, and the unsaturated zone, which is more surface, the soil strata, where you can have soil moisture, but it's not flowing saturated water area. We recharge these zones through precipitation. We can recharge them through other water sources. You see here a ditch that might be allowing water to flow and then recharging the soil moisture. And then also streams can be fed, as you mentioned, by groundwater discharge in addition to the ocean. We place great emphasis on water quality, and that's why we have defined some of these points of groundwater and surface water and how water moves and the whole hydrologic cycle and so on. And there are some major factors that determine how we can contaminate water. There are 5 major factors that determine how much contamination moving water picks up. They are the practices of the pesticide applicator, the amount of water on treated surfaces when we apply pesticides, the chemical characteristics in which we use, whether the chemical might be soluble or not insoluble. It may have some other characteristics. The soil type in which we apply or the chemical comes in contact, whether it's a sand or a loamy soil or a clay soil. And the location of the water table. We mentioned some confined and unconfined zones of the aquifers and so on. Those allow themselves to be very vulnerable in terms of pesticide application. So 5 major factors that you have to take into account in determining this whole issue of how to protect water quality. Here you see an illustration of just a cross-section of the environment and showing the strata in a limestone area. And that's one area that is extremely vulnerable to contact. And we mentioned that groundwater doesn't generally flow actively in most aquifers, but in limestone areas, we have what's called karst topography, where the limestone tends to dissolve and produce caves and conduits for the water to move. And so you can see that illustrated here. To prevent contamination, the pesticide user has to follow label rates and apply the pesticides to the soil or through an irrigation system only when necessary. And then some of the points here, you should be maintaining some type of an air gap to prevent back siphoning, which can pull chemical back into a water source. You need to be able to locate your handling areas that are away from these conduits, whether they're wellheads or some of the sinkholes we show here, which again are common in karst areas. And you need to dispose of containers and chemicals properly so that they're not in these areas where there might be a sinkhole or an old well. And this illustration gives you some examples of just how we might contaminate groundwater or even surface water. You have an area of water table, and you may have wells going down into that water table, whether it's deep wells or surface wells. And then you have, in this example, a waste disposal site, which allows chemical to leach very easily down into those either surface or groundwater areas, or run off into the river that's illustrated here. So a typical contamination through, in this case, both non-point and point sources. I want to go back and revisit this issue of back siphoning. Back siphoning is the movement of liquid pesticide mixture back through the fill hose into the water source. And it occurs when there's some interruption in the flow of either the pump that moves the fill water into the tank, or through some mechanism of low water pressure. In that process, a suction is created. And the suction is created when the fill hose is below the fill level in the tank. And so typically an applicator might be filling their tank. There's some interruption in the pump process of the fill water going to the tank, and suddenly you have this suction created, and it then siphons whatever's in the tank, and usually that's some type of mixture back to the water source and contaminates. There's laws passed to prevent this, or basically to try to prevent it, but the applicator has control over this, and there's two ways to prevent it from happening. One is just put the fill hose above the level of water in the tank. Otherwise, make sure there's an air gap in the fill hose. Or that you somehow, if you're filling directly from a water source, plumb in a backflow preventer. And these are devices that are on the market specifically for prevention of backflow, protection of water supplies. Here you see several examples of what we term backflow preventers and also check valves. A backflow preventer is specifically designed to allow air to bleed into the line in which you're trying to protect the fill water, for example, or the water that is flowing from the source to a particular use. And it is designed so that air is bled back into that line and breaks the suction that occurs. And this is really the only true backflow prevention device. There are a variety of these on the market. There are some that are very basic, some that are very sophisticated and obviously more expensive. And then also there's these check valves we show here. The check valve does not bleed air back into the line, but it does serve the purpose of stopping the backflow. It'll stop it, but it won't break it. If the device is not totally new and up to par, and it has been worn and used for a while, you can get some leakage in the valve that's in there. And because you don't break the siphon that occurs, then you can still get contaminant pulled back to the water source with these types of devices. So that's why you often see the terminology use of backflow preventers rather than check valves. So two examples here. We often emphasize the issue of the well. Wells can be easily contaminated if they're not built properly, and abandoned wells are quite a liability. If you see abandoned wells, you should try to eliminate them through either sealing them up or making sure that you don't use pesticides, or that there's flow going from one source or another into these abandoned wells. So they should be sealed. Working wells should be drilled and cased to more than 50 feet, or at least down to the bedrock in some cases, so that you can protect the wellhead itself. The wellhead's the most vulnerable part of the well, and it's important that it be extended above ground and have a concrete apron, and it's important for the well to be properly capped and maintained. Again, I would contact local health department authorities and other sources for this information, including some of the water authorities, on determining how to protect your well. Some other points here: if there's more water on the soil surface than it can hold, then when you're applying pesticides, you can easily get into a situation where this will contribute to runoff. This is affected by usually prolonged rain, but also if you're irrigating, these situations lend themselves for runoff movement, and you have to be very conscious of this issue. Mentioned earlier this issue of the characteristics of the pesticides you use, and they can affect the way that water can be contaminated, because the type of chemical you're using will move or persist or be absorbed in some way, depending on the quality of the material. So there's solubility, whether the chemical is highly soluble, and if it's highly soluble, it can move more easily in water. Whether it's adsorbed, and adsorbed meaning that it's held to the soil particles more easily, organic matter more easily. If it's not, then it might move. Or if it's persistent. If you have a persistent pesticide, then that means it's going to stay in the environment a little longer and be there so that then it can be in place to possibly move. Where a chemical is not persistent, may break down and may not be there as long, and there may not be the opportunity for contamination. So knowing this, then you can pretty much conclude that pesticides that are most likely to contaminate groundwater are highly soluble, moderately to highly persistent, and not readily absorbed on soil particles or organic matter.
Most of this stuff is just common.
Some soils have more storage capacity than other soils. Soils such as sandy soils and gravelly soils will allow water to flow very easily right through the soil. And if there's chemical in that water will then carry the chemical to the water source. Where soils that have higher loam or organic matter or clay content may hold not only more moisture, but also hold back that contaminant and not let it readily flow or run off or move to a water source. I mentioned earlier the issue of the water table, the distance from the soil surface of the water table, and the permeability of those geological layers underneath the soil surface all affect the potential for water contamination. Here you see some illustrations of different geological layers, and you can see just how much those layers might lend themselves to movement of water. You see sand and gravel with a lot of water visible there, igneous rocks, and also limestone as examples of different geological layers. Pesticides can move away from the release site when they are on or in objects or organisms that move or are moved off-site. Pesticides may stick to shoes or clothing, to animal fur, or to blowing dust, and may be transferred to other surfaces. When pesticide handlers bring home or wear home contaminated personal protective equipment, work clothing, or other items, residues can rub off on carpeting, furniture, and laundry items and onto pets and people. Pesticides may stick to treated surfaces, such as food or feed products that are to be sold. To protect consumers, there are legal limits or tolerances for how much pesticide residue may safely remain on crops or animal products that are sold for food or feed. Products that exceed these tolerances are illegal and cannot be sold. Crops and animal products will not be over tolerance if the pesticides are applied as directed on the product labeling. Illegal pesticide residues usually result when too much pesticide is applied to the crop or animal. The days to harvest, the days to grazing, or days to slaughter directions on the pesticide labeling are not obeyed, or pesticides move off the release site and contaminate plants or animals nearby. Non-target organisms may be harmed by pesticides in two ways. The pesticide may cause injury by contacting the non-target organism directly, or the pesticide may leave a residue that causes later injuries. Pesticides may harm non-target organisms that are present during a pesticide application. Poorly timed applications can kill bees and other pollinators that are active in or near the target site. Pesticides may harm other wildlife too. Even tiny amounts of some pesticides may harm them or destroy their source of food. Pesticides applied over large areas such as in mosquito, biting fly, and forest pest control must be chosen with great care to avoid poisoning non-target plants and animals in or near the target site. Read the warnings and directions on the pesticide labeling carefully to avoid harming non-target organisms during a pesticide application. Drift from the target site may injure wildlife, livestock, pets, sensitive plants, and people. For example, drift of herbicides can damage sensitive nearby plants, including crops, forests, or ornamental plantings. Drift can also kill beneficial parasites and predators that are near the target site. Pesticide runoff may harm fish and other aquatic animals, and plants in ponds, streams, and lakes. Aquatic life also can be harmed by careless tank filling or draining, and by rinsing or discarding used containers along or in waterways. Pesticide residues can have harmful effects on the habitats in which organisms live, either by affecting their food sources, their shelter, or the whole ecosystem. Sometimes animals can be harmed when they feed on plants or animals that have pesticide residues on or in them. A special concern is for predatory birds or mammals that feed on animals that have been killed by pesticides. The predators may be harmed by pesticide residues remaining on or in the bodies of the dead animals. Sometimes surfaces are harmed by pesticides or pesticide residues. Some surfaces may become discolored by contact with certain pesticides. Other surfaces may be pitted or marked by contact with some pesticides. And some pesticides can corrode or obstruct electronic systems or metal. Sometimes a pesticide may leave a visible deposit on the treated surface.
And that's the end of the lesson on pesticides in the environment. Thanks for listening.
So basically, be careful about where you spray. Kill people.
Pretty much, Tyler. It's,
That's pretty much what I gleaned from that.
well, you were correct in what you said, that a lot of this is common sense. And it has some regulations that are included on labels of pesticides. And they're there for a reason. But most of the time, chemicals are safe if they are used in accordance with the label. Yeah, there's some potential for damage and danger and so forth, but generally that's not the case.
That goes the same, that's said for pretty much everything.
It is.
If you use it as intended, it's safe, otherwise you don't know what can happen.
Salt and sugar can kill you, you know, if you consume too much of either. You know,
Even water can kill you.
even water can tell you that there've been people that
Drink themselves to death with
died from drinking too much water. It's rare, but it does happen.
Water drop.
Yeah, exactly. One of the last photos that was there showed a picture of an eagle. And eagles were placed on the endangered species a number of years ago because they were having problems with hatching of the young. You weren't getting the young eagles to hatch because of problems that they were having with the eggs of the eagle. And the researchers did a lot of work trying to figure out what was causing it. And they did track that one to a pesticide that was being used. It was a compound called DDT, which was a wonderful insecticide. And it was primarily used in wide areas for mosquito control, although it was a good general insecticide that was used in a lot of crops. But the majority of the DDT was sprayed in an attempt to control mosquitoes. And with that, they were spraying areas that contained water around the edges of streams and pools and swampy areas and so forth. And DDT was like chloridane that I mentioned to you guys a class or two ago. It's another of the class of chlorinated hydrocarbons. And those chemicals have a history and a reputation of have a tremendous longevity. In other words, they don't break down readily in the environment. And what was happening with the DDT application, they would spray it on water, and it would kill the mosquito larvae that was there, and little mammals, things would eat those larvae, or potentially other little aquatic animals that were there, little minnows and so forth. Then that DDT became a part of the food chain in that it was consumed, and because of the longevity of it, little fish and little mammals became a carrier for the DDT. Then bigger fish ate the little fish, and what was happening, these eagles and aquatic feeder type birds were getting a fair percentage of those fish. And the DDT was building up in the bodies of these predatory type birds, and it was making the shells of the eggs, when they laid the eggs to begin their, made them too thin, and the eggs would not survive the normal processes of the hatching process. So we lost numerous generations of baby eagles because of the application of DDT to control mosquitoes. So for that reason, DDT was one of the reasons it was taken off the market. But that's just a side effect of, and it was an unintended effect. So the solution was to take the material off the market. So that's one of the things we do. Any other questions from any of you about the video and Dr. Weaver's presentation? A lot of content in that, but as Tyler said, it was common sense. The majority of that was common sense. There's a little bit about non-point and point source pollution that you may not be your common use.
Terminology for.
Yeah, but then the idea of water movement and the different types of soils and so forth, it's common sense. So, if you don't have any questions, I'm done. So that's kind of what I hope to cover today, and we'll pick this up on Monday. We'll look at the next chapter. It won't be long before we get to an academic exercise, but I think we'll cover one more chapter before we do. Okay?
You're okay?
Thanks, Tom.
Thank you, John.